Hello, I am back. Maybe. I think I made that promise last time and then life got in the way again. Speaking of life, my house is really noisy right now, so if you hear background noise, I apologize. My name is Megan and I narrate videos on the British royal family here on YouTube. Sometimes. I really do enjoy making these things, so if you could leave a comment or like the video, I would truly appreciate it. I know most of the people watching today are return viewers, so thank you again for waiting for me. Harry's book is about to drop, so I thought I would revisit the topic of royal spares, but in order to really set up that discussion, we have to get a few things out of the way. The first is that the language here on its own is pretty shitty. Relegating how you describe someone to their role in a hereditary monarchy has a certain ick factor, but unfortunately I'm going to have to participate in using these terms for clarity's sake. The second is that I'm going to spend a good portion of this video comparing and contrasting the treatment of two very famous royal spares, Harry and Margaret. There are a lot of similarities, but there are also a lot of differences, and you can't talk about the differences without acknowledging that Harry and Meghan were subjected to an entirely different level of hate because Meghan Markle isn't white. This video isn't really going to focus on that topic, but it needs to and should be acknowledged. So let's have a very quick and dirty history lesson on royal spares. Although the term heir versus spare wasn't coined in England until the late 1800s, ironically by an American Vanderbilt married to an aristo, the battles between the sons and even a few daughters of a monarch are well documented throughout the history of almost all cultures. Cleopatra versus Ptolemy, Elizabeth versus Mary, Philip versus Ferdinand. There is a Wikipedia page dedicated to the Wars of Succession, and my friends, while not all of those were due to siblings fighting, it is a very, very long list. In cultures where there were imperial harems, a single monarch could have many sons, and it was almost seen as a rite of passage for the son who would eventually become the next ruler to kill many of his rival brothers on his way to the throne. In England, the concept of a spare began in the 12th century, whereas before then, all sons of a monarch could be considered up for the role, and it wasn't uncommon for the role to pass to a younger son, which caused its own issues, just ask William the Conqueror. Post-12th century, English royalty adopted the concept of male preference primogeniture. I struggle at pronouncing that word, but that means that it was the right of the firstborn son to inherit the throne. It wasn't until Charlotte was born in 2013, yes, you heard that right, that the United Kingdom adopted the concept of absolute primogeniture, meaning that the line of succession marches down by birth order regardless of sex. As the concept of an heir was defined, so then was the concept of having spares. While the institution of the British royal family prides itself on never changing despite the times, a lot has changed since the 12th century. Which of course has led to changes in the heir versus spare dynamic. Probably the biggest is that royal families are just less likely to lose an heir in the modern age. Historically, it wasn't all that uncommon to lose children to disease, famine, war. Even as adults, people's literal lives were much less certain, and while they tended to have children younger than we do now, they also tended to die much earlier. Another big change as history marched on is that spares just don't usurp like they used to, which is boring. Safer, but boring. A popular brother used to be a real threat to a king, especially one that wasn't churning out his own set of heirs and spares. In the modern age, no one is usurping anybody. The last change I will talk about is that family size has gotten smaller over time. The days of kings and queens having 5+ children is probably over, and in my opinion, the absolute worst cases of heir versus spare have happened when a nuclear family only includes one spare. As I mentioned in the intro, the two spares I'll be focusing on are Margaret and Harry. There is a remarkable amount of similarities between the two situations despite being separated by a generation. The British royal family, if anything, are dedicated to ensuring they never learn from past failures. The TLDR of this whole video is that the setup was mostly the same, nuclear families with 2 children close in age and of the same sex, where the younger child was used by the royal system to publicly prop up the older one despite this causing obvious harm. Now, of course, this comparison is overly simplistic, and I want to be clear that I have no doubt that Margaret could be an incredibly difficult person. There is also little doubt that she personally held bigoted and racist beliefs. That being said, there is no doubt she was deeply unhappy, which probably played a role in her heavy drinking and smoking. The Queen Mother died at 101, the Queen at 96. Margaret died at 71 and had been in ill health for almost 20 years before she passed. Reading through sources for this video, I found myself thinking, how much of the public myth surrounding Margaret is even real? Even back in the 40s and 50s, how much of the party princess narrative was driven by the palace machine trying to prop up her sister? Elizabeth married a foreigner with no real titles or wealth, whose sisters had been married to literal Nazis. That was always eyebrow-raising, but back in 1946, that was definitely a choice. A few years later, she would become queen at 25. You have to ask, knowing what we know about the relationship between the press and the palace, how much of Margaret's supposed partying was played up to make the new, very young queen with the eyebrow-raising husband look more mature and stable in comparison. As they entered the late 50s, there would be persistent rumors that Philip had strayed. How much of Margaret's romantic entanglements were plastered on front pages to distract from that? Margaret's official biographer claims that the very first time they met, Margaret said, quote, "I expect before you met me, you thought I was the sort of person the tabloids said I was. And now you know I'm not." It's both interesting and sad that the exact same quote could have been pulled from Harry's book almost 40 years later. Despite everything, Margaret and the Queen, at least publicly, remained close. You have to wonder how much of that was because Margaret remained dependent on her for resources. I know people have pointed out that Harry was able to leave the family and that Margaret could have done the same if she'd been willing to give up the perks of royalty. I honestly don't really feel like that's a fair comparison. The world would have looked very different for a woman in the 1950s suddenly without her family's protection, and, to be frank, Peter Townsend was no Meghan Markle. Margaret escaped in the way she knew how, and in the way that was socially acceptable, spending much of her time on the tropical island of Mystique from the 1970s on until her health made it impossible. Now, we're going to skip a generation. You might be wondering why. Where's Charles and his spare? Well, remember when I said that things tend to go a little bit better when there are more than 2 kids? The overall situation protected Charles's generation from the level of intensity seen with both Margaret and even more so with Harry. Plainly speaking, Anne broke up the all-boys problem, and the fact that Andrew was 12 years Charles's junior meant that with the exception of their respective marriages, they traveled through most milestones separately. There were definitely times when they married so close together that the press treated Andrew and Charles like heir and the spare, though, to be honest, it was mostly played out by proxy between their 2 wives. Looking back through headlines, it appears that all 3 of Charles's siblings spent time deflecting criticism from him. There being 4 in that generation made it less claustrophobic, less focused on a single spare. If anything, towards the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, Diana took the brunt of the spare treatment. Before we talk about Harry, I'd like to try and answer the question of who keeps this narrative going. Is it the palace or is it the press? The answer is both, which is why I have been making references to the palace machine. I've come to see the royals and the press as 2 heads of a shared entity. There is a handshake, a contract that has evolved over time. Back in the early 20th century, when it wasn't necessarily socially acceptable to criticize the royal family, the palace was able to just squash stories through their relationships with the editors of these publications. After the wave of cynicism that accompanied World War II, it became more socially acceptable to criticize those in power, including, of course, the royal family. Editors were no longer willing to just squash stories for free. Publications were then fed juicy stories about the spares, along with just general access to the family as a whole in exchange for positive or no coverage of the heirs. Outside of this very visible contract, there is also the fact that in the end, institutions just tend to protect each other. The UK press has a vested interest in the monarchy continuing, therefore there are plenty of times where their interests align. The press seem to be willing to take a hit to their journalistic credibility as long as nothing is uncovered that might actually take a real chunk out of public support for the monarchy as an institution. I'm going to start grumbling about Andrew here in a second, but let's get back to the topic at hand. It was clear that Harry was in trouble even as a small child. Diana allegedly had to tell the Queen Mother to stop openly favoring William to give you an idea of what was going on behind the scenes. Out in the open, the family would hold press calls where both boys were acting like boys. Yet, the press would only comment on Harry's behavior and not William's. This would continue into their adult years, and I think it can be summed up like this. Adult William sucks. I know people will say that is my inherent bias, but just listen for just 1 sec. He is among the laziest working royals, not entering full-time royal work until his late 30s, and still coming up short against much older relatives. He's gaffe-prone. and often obviously unprepared for the few engagements he does do. Like his grandfather before him, there have been a stream of affair rumors, and for a while there was a steady stream of photos of him engaging with women on vacations where his wife and small children were not present. Taxpayers refurbished Kensington Palace only to have him move to Windsor for questionable reasons. He routinely takes short helicopter rides, possibly just between his 4 homes. But I bet most people, even people with a passing interest in the royal family, have never heard most of that. I will bet that those same people have heard of every mistake Harry has ever made publicly. And that, my friends, is no coincidence. Knowing that your own family is more than willing to feed the press negative stories because your brother did something stupid again has to weigh on a person. And I think in hindsight, it was easy to see that it did weigh on Harry over the years. As early as the mid-2000s, he was telling interviewers he wasn't super happy and would like to maybe move to Africa for a bit. Reminiscent of Margaret's move to Mystique. As compared to his brother and father, Harry has been the most open about his dislike for the royal press pack. To have an armchair psychology moment, I think it was clear that some of Harry's behavior in the 2000s was a sign he was struggling. And instead of doing what families are supposed to do, they took delight in the fact that Harry's bad behavior being on the front page meant that Charles and William were not. This would of course echo in their treatment of Harry's wife a decade later. You might be thinking all of this sounds very reminiscent of a dysfunctional family system known as Golden Child versus the Scapegoat. Is Heir vs. Spare just the royal version? Yeah, it is. I think the reason a lot of people have interest in this whole drama is it feels familiar. Harry and Meghan have very publicly broken a lot of dysfunctional family taboos. They've rocked the boat. They've cut off narcissistic parents. Harry, as the scapegoat, is being honest and public about his experiences in his dysfunctional family system, and according to the people who have propagated that experience and abuse, that should not be happening. So much of the hate he receives, outside of the obvious racism, is because he has transcended the role that was forced on him through the order of his birth, and I think that overarching story again feels very familiar to a lot of people who might not be royal, but who can identify the golden child and the scapegoat in their own families. Why does any of this matter? Well, it's mean. It's mean and does harm to children, both royal and not, to use them as a scapegoat for a favored child. In the case of royal children, you then have to add an entire country's press attention on top. We have seen the result of this scapegoat spare treatment in our own families. Not only is it mean, but it's happening again. We are supposed to get better with time, to know more, to understand more. But when it comes to the royal family, they refuse to change, and you cannot tell me as we watch the press coverage of George versus Louis that Heir vs. Spare isn't gearing up all over again. It will be cute at first, like it was for Harry, cheeky little Louis. But as George enters his teenage years and the kids are deemed old enough to attack, that narrative will start to have teeth. And that's deeply unfortunate. Well, literally as I'm editing this script, Harry's book leaked. The Guardian is running an excerpt with the claim that William physically assaulted Harry after an argument where William showed up to the cottage apparently looking for and very angry with a very pregnant Meghan, only to tell Harry he found her rude and abrasive, which led to him grabbing Harry by the collar and shoving him onto the floor. What a mess, although not necessarily a surprising one. We have heard over and over again about how angry William is from both the press and his own family. The usual suspects are, interestingly enough, not out here with denials, but again with the claim that Harry shouldn't air his family's dirty laundry. This claim is always fun and plays directly into the Heir vs. Spare narrative. The heir and the institution have been leaking against the Sussexes for 7 years now. They have been airing dirty laundry. They've been making up laundry. But Harry, the spare, is supposed to keep secrets to protect the heir. That's all they see him as. With every bit of breaking news, it becomes clearer why Harry left the firm. I want to thank you again for watching my video. I am hoping to have one up with Mom here soon, but my 5-month-old, can you believe it, demands a lot of my time. I need to apologize again. I know you could hear my dog and probably my baby and maybe my husband in the background of this video, but I hope this video has found you well, and I hope to see you again here soon.